So in this video, I'm going to try to give you a generalized overall interpretation of Nietzsche's thought by talking about a few of his central ideas and also by seeing how he compares to other philosophers. This interpretation should be useful as a foundation for further study and also to help you make sense of some of the things you might have already heard about him. So here's a list of terms that will not be in this video. Because first of all, you can hear about these in a bunch of other introductions. But also, I don't think these terms belong in an introduction. I'm not going to spend any time correcting misinformation that's out there about these, but I think that this video should give you at least enough familiarity with Nietzsche that you'll already be suspicious about the way people use these terms. Okay, so let's set up some other philosophers to compare Nietzsche to. Here's the first guy, Epicurus. Epicurus is a Greek guy who thinks that the most important thing is pleasure, and he believes that normal everyday life in society brings us more pain than it does pleasure. And so to escape that, he basically starts a commune where he hangs out with all his friends and eats bread and cheese and escapes the anxiety and suffering of everyday life. Epicurus doesn't worry about all the expensive luxury items that he can't have because he's not living in society. Because for him, the highest pleasure is freedom from anxiety and suffering. So to him, all the work you would have to do to maintain an extravagant lifestyle isn't worth it. It's better to just be comfortable and free from the hassle. You can think of him as a wiser version of your friend who always does the easiest thing and doesn't like to have any responsibilities. Next, we're going to talk about some very different philosophers. Here's the Stoics. Alright, the Stoics don't agree with Epicurus. They don't think that pleasure is the most important thing. To them, it's much more important to be ethical. So you can't just run off and live in a commune because you have responsibilities to the people around you. And it's selfish to just run away and worry about your own pleasure. But they do agree that normal life in society does kind of suck. So their solution is to be involved in society, but not get emotionally involved. See, to them, everything's out of your control, and you can't change the world around you. But they think that you can change your attitude to the bad things that are happening to you, and get to a point where you don't care and it doesn't affect you. So you can just keep doing what you gotta do. They have all kinds of little tricks for not caring, like they visualize bad things happening so that when they actually do happen, they're ready for them. Think of the Stoics as a wiser version of your friend who thinks it's really cool not to care about stuff. Because then you can never make fun of them, and you're like, hey, look, your shirt looks stupid, and they're like, I don't care. Alright, we have one more philosopher to talk about before we get to Nietzsche. It's Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thinks that life is even worse than the Epicureans and the Stoics make it out to be. He thinks that life is always filled with more pain than pleasure. Happiness is impossible, and life is always a mistake for everybody. So for him, you shouldn't get involved in the world physically or emotionally. You shouldn't really care about anything or do anything. You should just meditate and get to a place where you don't desire anything, which is very much like the Buddha, who had very similar teachings. Except Schopenhauer also thought that music could help us escape the will to live. And also like the Buddha, Schopenhauer thinks we should help other people reach enlightenment and get to a point where they stop caring, so that all suffering can finally come to an end. But Schopenhauer takes this view to an extreme that the Buddha doesn't, because Schopenhauer is an antinatalist, so he thinks we shouldn't have any more babies, and life should come to an end. So basically, Schopenhauer hates life. And that brings us to Nietzsche. What does Nietzsche think about all of these philosophers? Well, he thinks they are all sick, decadent life deniers. So it's obvious why Schopenhauer is a life denier, because he literally wants us to deny it. But what about the Epicureans and the Stoics? What does Nietzsche have against them? Nietzsche thinks that they're not affirming the whole of life, particularly suffering, which Nietzsche doesn't think is a bad thing. It's just that these philosophers can't handle it. He compares them to people with weak stomachs. He says that Epicureans are like people with weak stomachs who avoid all the foods they can't handle and only eat the weak things they can handle, like applesauce and baby food. And the Stoics are like people with weak stomachs who have scraped off all their taste buds and drunk battery acid so they don't have to feel anything anymore. And nothing affects them, but they also miss out on most of life. So Nietzsche wants to be healthy and have a life-affirming philosophy. But that doesn't mean that he thinks those other philosophies are necessarily wrong, because he doesn't think that there is one right philosophy. He thinks the philosophy that makes sense for you depends on the kind of person you are. And also, being a sick person isn't necessarily bad, because Nietzsche used to be a big fan of Schopenhauer. And he thinks that that sickness was necessary to his later health. Because if he wasn't first sick and unhappy with life, he wouldn't later be able to love it so much. If Nietzsche thought sickness were bad, he'd be making the same mistake these other philosophers are making about suffering, because they don't see how it's a valuable part of life. How for Nietzsche, it teaches us about ourselves and is also inseparable from joy. So if you want to remove all the suffering out of your life, you also have to remove things like romantic love. And all those other philosophers thought you should do that. Like Epicurus thought that love was too unsettling and you should just stick to masturbation and hanging out with friends. And the Stoics believed in marriage, but thought it should be passionless and just about making babies for society. And Schopenhauer didn't believe in marriage and he hates babies. So Nietzsche thinks because they can't handle love and suffering, they can only see what's bad about them. So this is a quote about life deniers and how they see suffering. He's particularly referencing the Buddha here. They encounter a sick man or an old man or a corpse. And immediately they say, life is refuted, but only they themselves are refuted, and their eyes, which see only this one face of existence. They're not seeing the value of suffering. So our first question is, what is Nietzsche's supposedly life-affirming philosophy? And that brings us to him, Friedrich Nietzsche. So here's how Nietzsche wants to affirm the whole of life. Amor fati, which is Latin for love of fate. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, but love it. When he says not merely bear what's necessary, he's referencing the Stoics who just put up with stuff. And he's saying, as opposed to that we should love everything that's necessary, including the suffering. And at this point, it's not exactly clear what that means, right? Because does it even make sense to say that somebody can suffer and constantly love everything at the same time? Well, it'll become clearer in a second because he has a thought experiment to test whether we are amor fati correctly. I'm not going to read the second quote on this slide. You definitely should, but I want us to note in both quotes how he starts with my formula and I want, because remember that he's not saying that this is the right philosophy for everybody. Alright, but here is the thought experiment to test our amor fati levels. It's called the eternal recurrence. So the quote starts off by saying that a demon comes to you in the middle of the night and tells you that your life is going to repeat itself over and over again infinitely. And it's going to be exactly the same every time. Which Nietzsche's not saying that this is a real thing, or that it even necessarily makes any sense. What's important to him is our immediate reaction to being told this news. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment where you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? So he's saying if I'm a life denier, this is going to be the worst news anybody's ever told me. But if I'm amor fati enough, which he doesn't necessarily think we can be all the time, we can only feel that way certain times, like after a tremendous moment. We'll inevitably have moments of regret, but he thinks that we should always work towards being able to say yes to the demon. But the question is, what kind of life would make us say yes? Is it a life where we have more pain than pleasure? Is it one where we do a lot of good deeds? For Nietzsche, it's a life that's beautiful. It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. Now that's an early quote, so he's a little more dogmatic and uses the word only. He doesn't necessarily think that there aren't other ways to affirm life. Here's a later quote saying roughly the same thing. As an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable to us. And the rest of this quote starts to answer our next question, which is how do we make our life an aesthetic phenomenon or a work of art? Art furnishes us with the eye and hand and above all the good conscience to make such an aesthetic phenomenon of ourselves. So he's saying that there is a way to make ourselves beautiful. We want to be the poets of our own lives. How do we do that? One thing is needful: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. So Nietzsche thinks that we should give ourselves style and make ourselves interesting characters. And he even says for him that's the one thing that's needful. This is one of Nietzsche's central ideas, and it's often referred to as self-creation. But what's so important about giving ourselves style? Well, it's very similar to why a work of art needs style. Because first of all, a work of art needs to be noticeably different from other works of art for us to even be able to appreciate it. And to be distinct, it needs to be a single thing with a single vision that brings it all together, which Nietzsche calls having a single taste. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose. If only it was a single taste. And that last line, that's where most people get off the Nietzsche train. Because what he just said was, he thinks it's less important whether people are good or bad than that they're an interesting character. And there's a lot more I could say about self-creation, but I should tell you about the biggest problem a lot of people have with Nietzsche. Because many people think it doesn't really matter if an axe murderer is an interesting character. It's not okay to be an axe murderer. And there weren't any specific axe murderers that Nietzsche was a fan of. We could imagine a hypothetical axe murderer, sure. But Nietzsche was a big fan of Napoleon. And a lot of people would say, Napoleon's not that great. He killed a bunch of people. He's kind of a jerk. And that's why Nietzsche gets into his famous arguments against morality. Because he wants to defend people who are interesting, but also evil, like Napoleon. So what does Nietzsche have to say about morality? Who represents the greatest danger for all of man's future? Is it not the good and the just? So Nietzsche seems to think that morality can do a lot of harm. His biggest problem with it is that it wants everybody to be exactly the same. By giving us all the same rules and appealing to what we all have in common, like how we all feel pain and compassion, or how we're all supposedly children of God. But remember how Nietzsche thinks that there isn't one philosophy that's right for everybody, and also how it's good to have style and be different. For those reasons, he thinks that morality can seriously limit human potential. And on top of that, it's out to try to end all suffering in the world. And remember, Nietzsche doesn't think suffering's bad. To him, a world without suffering would be a boring, ugly world, just like a world where everybody's all the same. And he thinks if he were to live in a world like that, it would be impossible to affirm all of existence. And so here comes Nietzsche's nightmare scenario, called The Last Man, which is supposed to be his dystopia brought on by too much morality and avoiding suffering. Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Thus asks the last man, and he blinks. See how the last man no longer understands all these things that Nietzsche thinks are important parts of life. By the way, the last man refers to multiple people, but he calls them the last man because they're all pretty much the same person. No shepherd in one herd. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into the madhouse. And then Nietzsche went crazy, the end. Alright, so here's some further reading. Don't stop watching the video. If you want to learn more about Nietzsche, I recommend out of all his books that you start with The Gay Science, specifically the Walter Kaufmann translation. A lot of the ideas in this video originate from this book. It has a lot more detail about him and also has a lot of other stuff we didn't even get into. Nietzsche doesn't just like beauty and art, he's also a big fan of truth, but we didn't have time to talk about that. One of the main themes of The Gay Science is him trying to combine both of those values. But it's also a good idea to not start out by reading Nietzsche directly. So I've recommended a book about Nietzsche that this video is heavily influenced by. Nietzsche, Life as Literature. A lot of my own interpretation of Nietzsche comes from this book, and it's one of my favorite works of philosophy, along with The Gay Science. Here's some shorter stuff that you don't have to read. 2 free lectures about the gay science by a couple of Stanford professors. They talk about a lot of the same things I do. The 2 lectures really complement each other because the 2 guys kind of disagree. These are the best introductory Nietzsche lectures I could find. They're about an hour each, and you can speed them up if you want. I also linked 2 webcomics about Nietzsche. They're fun and they're really short to read.